The four gods of the One Piece world mentioned in the Harley text were actually first mentioned during Skypiea. In addition to that, Lightning God Enel was a test character for Demon God Emu. The promise between Noland and Calgara became the foundation of the promise between Joy Boy and the ancient mermaid princess, and reigniting the light of Shandora was an early addition of bringing about the dawn of the world. As more and more time goes on, it's become clear that Skypiea's function was a template arc. It was a beta test for the bigger story that is One Piece. And so understanding what happened on Skypiea informs us not only of what happened all the way back when during the Void Century, but also what will happen all the way forward now in the final war. Skypiea is where the meta story of One Piece really started to take form. It's where Oda decided to stop allowing so many distractions into the story, and he decided to truly focus on the setup of both the ancient history and the far future of the series. Prior to Skypiea, the endgame of One Piece was never in sight, and arguably after Skypiea it still wasn't, because almost nobody noticed the seeds that Oda planted right here, with factors such as having Luffy take on the Nika silhouette for the first time in chapter 253, as well as Noland's flashback being our first mention of the Sun God. And not only that, Skypiea dropped a grand total of 4 gods, which is something that the Harley text has since gone on to confirm. There are 4 gods. The Skypiea flashback specifically mentions the god of the sun, the god of the forest, god of the earth, and god of rain. And that last one there, that appears to have been retconned into the god of the sea by the Harley text. Although, because what we're talking about here is fictional history, it could be a misunderstanding or cultural mistranslation. But Skypiea is also where the idea of gods is explored for the first time in general. Prior to this, One Piece hadn't touched the idea of faith at all, which has gone on to become an integral motif in the final saga, focusing on the faith of the Buccaneers, the Giants, and also likely the Lunarians, and specifically their faith in the sun god Nika. And so the first time you go through One Piece, there is this tendency to view Skypiea as a glorified side story, like a season of filler. But in actuality, Skypiea, it is the main quest line. And a saga like Alabasta was more of a side story, which resulted from Eiichiro Oda arbitrarily creating 7 Warlords of the Sea, and then after choosing that number, needing to explore them. Whereas Skypiea, due to the nature of its location, it was an arc where Oda could write with 0 distractions. We were on an isolated island. There were no marines, no world government, no rival warlords. In fact, no rival pirates at all, really. And all that Oda had to work with was the deep history of the world it is that he created. So let's start by looking at probably the most obvious key similarity, which is Enel and Emu. Both of these figures rule their respective worlds with near omniscient power, to the point of being able to erase entire islands that displease them, which Enel did with Angel Island, leaving a crater in the same shape as that circle in the ocean, where I am informed that Lucia didn't used to exist in. Emu's reasoning hasn't fully been made clear yet, but he appears to desire to flood the world and get rid of the eyesores of humanity. Emu is trying to create Mu's world, and in Mu's world there is no place for the disgusting humans. And Enel was doing the same thing, but in the sky. I'll do away with all the people unsuited for this sky. I'll return everything to its rightful shape. That is my duty as God. This is the sky. This is the domain of God. Everything's an eyesore. People, trees, earth, all of it. Go back to where you belong. Enel's language is especially noteworthy here after reading chapter 1163, because Enel describes those who do not belong in the domain of the sky as eyesores, which is exactly how Emu refers to the marines and the pirates that he sees after taking command of Saint Saturn's body. He uses the word eyesore. It is very specific language, and most of the elders and common world nobles tend to describe humans as insects. And as we've already alluded to, Enel's arc maxim was strikingly similar to Emu's use of the ancient weapon Uranus. Enel, the surprise engineering genius that he genuinely is, even ended up creating his own rudimentary mother flame system powered by his access to infinite electricity via his devil fruit. And the language that one Garnfall uses to describe the act of destroying Angel Island was that Enel, quote, completely erased it, which again is the same language that Emu and this time the 5 elders use for their assorted acts of nefarity as well, particularly when describing a light that needs to be erased from history. And quite frankly, what we could be seeing with Enel is an off-cycle god. According to the Harley text, each god has taken it in turns to create the world in their own image, and according to the prophecy, it is the sun god's turn next. But who knows, another few thousand years down the line, it could be the thunder god's turn, and whoever ends up with Enel's devil fruit will be selected by fate to remake the world in their image just as Enel wanted. ended. And in regards to looking backwards to the Void Century, Enel is a god who took over from a previous god named Garnfall, which is also in line with what we know of the Harley text, as prior to the sea god taking over and creating this world, it was allegedly under the domain of the forest god. And there's also something to be said in the idea that Luffy is Enel's natural counter, just as I imagine that Luffy, Joy Boy, I guess Nika, will also serve to be Emu's natural counter as well. But the golden city of Shandora is also a template for the great kingdom of the Void Century, with the Shandians themselves being a test case for the D-Clan, as Shandora was said to be wiped out and destroyed, with its descendants protecting what little remained of it and waiting for a certain day to arrive. Which sounds a lot like what we're doing right now, waiting for that certain day. But in the case of Shandora, this was on a much smaller scale. It was all about the poneglyph. They were waiting for the day when the purpose of the Great Cube would be fulfilled. And in the case of the Great Kingdom, they were and still are waiting for the dawn of the world. And just in case you had any doubt, listen to this, the words of Wiper. You can't topple the history of the proud warriors who lived in the land of Shandora. No matter where we are, our strength endures. We give birth to it and cultivate it. You can't topple that sublime power. No matter how much of the forest you burn, no matter how many ruins you crumble, the earth will not lose. And this is such a classic Will of D statement to make. It's also interesting that Wiper specifically makes note of two other substances, forest and earth, which each have their own respective gods. But what this is also doing is emphasizing the power of land. The earth will not lose feels especially potent in the grand scheme of One Piece, as the Void Century seems to have been a battle of land versus sea, a war that still rages on to this very day in Mu's incomplete world, with the sea in a superior position, and yet the land remains. It endures. However small and scattered the islands of the One Piece world may be, the land refuses to lose to the sea. And Skypiea put further focus on the value of land by referring to it as Verth. To the people living on all of the clouds, Verth is this magical substance capable of both giving and sustaining life. And Garnfall even comes to the conclusion that Verth is such a divine miracle that they never had the right to claim ownership of it. And Verth is also the treasure that could give us one of our potential answers as to what the actual One Piece is, which is the sunken world below the sea. And one day we will finally reunite the planet in one piece once that land finally sees the blissful light of dawn again. And of course, the Great Kingdom ended up vanishing from the world in the same way that Shandora did. Shandora was shot up into the sky, into the heavens. And look, if Uranus had anything to do with it, then the Great Kingdom was probably shot down into the sea to the depths of hell. But where the parallels become genuinely captivating for me, and not just parallels, is when we explore the promise that was made during the Void Century between Joy Boy and the Mermaid Princess. A promise which was not kept. And this exact same idea exists in the Skypiea story, with Calgara's promise to keep ringing the golden bell, the light of Shandora, so that Noland could return one day. And Noland's promise in return was, "We'll meet again, I promise you." And again, neither of these promises would be kept. And the Lion Noland children's book almost serves as the apology poneglyph that Joy Boy left. However, these promises would be fulfilled 400 years later by their descendants, Wiper and Mont Blanc Cricket, with the help of Mr. Monkey D. Luffy, of course, to actually ring the bell, to restore the light of Shandora. And I would personally also make the argument that Calgara could be a bit of a template for Joy Boy's role during the Void Century. Calgara was a warrior who fought with a smile, and one who was deliberately framed against the sun in the same way that only the most special of One Piece characters are, your Luffy's, your Bonnies, etc. There's also the fact that the original sun god Nika silhouette looked very Shandian, very tribal, you see. And Calgara himself, he had the role of bringing light and hope into the world. In fact, in Noland's words, "In the midst of a storm, this light extended a hand to us. Even though I shouldn't have been able to hear it through the storm, I heard the sound of this bell." And so Calgara ringing the golden bell, the light of Shandora, I'm going to keep saying that, but Calgara ringing the bell, it almost sounds like the drums of liberation. Calgara was this beacon of musical quality, and the world only fell into despair once Calgara lost access to the bell. And the world only properly regained hope once the bell was rung again, just like the re-emergence of the drums of liberation, or in the words of Garnfall, the return of the song of the island. The unnamed Shandian chief stated that Calgara's greatest regret was not being able to keep his promise to Noland. So Calgara wasn't just going to war in the sky to defend his home from invaders, he was doing it to keep his promise. Which I think gives us a clue as to how Joy Boy failed. What probably happened is that somehow the drums of liberation disappeared. And from there, Joy Boy fought valiantly, but he was ultimately overcome and he left regret behind. And all of this will almost certainly play into the modern day as well, as Luffy is going to trigger the dawn of the world, but it's very unlikely that he's going to do it for the sake of the world or any big picture ambition, and instead he will more than likely do it as a favor or to keep a promise or for some other kind of selfish kind of small scale reasoning, just like how his driving force to beat Enel was to ring the golden bell. Luffy didn't defeat Enel and save Skypiea because it was the right thing to do. He did it so that he could send a message to Cricket. And in Robin's words, isn't that a wonderful reason? He's a romantic. Even when things look hopeless, he would give up his chance to escape just for that. He's a bit crazy. And crazy though he may be, Luffy managed to simultaneously fulfill the will of both Norland and Calgara, to keep the promise that they made to each other 400 years ago. And we were then given this by the narrator. The sound of the bell boasted the glories of the vanished city as the light of Shandora. It declared the end of the fighting with a love song, the song of the island. After being silenced for those 400 years, the golden bell fulfilled its promise. Now keep that text in mind, because I bet that we are going to hear something extremely similar when the dawn of the world does come about. Something about how the drums of liberation had been silenced for 800 years, and about the dawn of the world and fulfilling promises and all of the stuff. Especially since what Luffy unknowingly did on Skypiea was end a 400-year-long war, which he'll do again, as Vegapunk stated that the Void Century War never actually ended. Ever since then, this world has been stuck in this 800-year-long war. And in addition to that, something that I almost never see mentioned in any Skypiea discourse is that Skypiea had its own equivalent of the Marines, a military faction known as the White Berets, led by one Captain McKinley, who wears his jacket in the same sort of style that all high-ranking Marines do, because they're all too cool to actually put their arms through their sleeves and such. And the White Berets for most of Skypiea are a completely unreasonable antagonistic force. They are dead set on capturing and punishing the Straw Hats for committing a wide range of sky crimes. In fact, I believe that the Straw Hats commit at least 11 different classes of crime during their short time on Skypiea, but the White Berets are almost like a parody of the Marines. However, if you do go through Skypiea once again, I would say review their actions very carefully, because by the end of the Skypiea, the White Berets decide to enact their own justice. They see Enel for the devil that he is as opposed to a god, and they use all of their power to evacuate and protect the Sky citizens, which is very much in line with the Kobe philosophy of justice, to protect the lives of the innocent above all else, especially when you reside above all else. And so the White Berets are a small-scale representation of how I expect the Marines to be acting by the end of One Piece. Once they realize the purpose they're actually serving is an antithesis as to why they actually enlisted, they will have a choice to make. And it might not happen under the direct command of Sakazuki, because he's a bit of a wild card for the future, but I do think that the Marines en masse are going to have a huge wake-up call, and they will make the decision to enact the justice that they thought they were providing. And so those few 100,000 Marines will be busy saving people all over the world from whatever Emu's inevitable apocalyptic threat is going to be. And I also don't think that the Marines are going to collapse as an organization following the dawn of the world, as what happened to the White Berets after Skypiea is that they rebranded themselves as God's Guards, incorporated members of the Shandian tribe, and they now work together to serve actual justice. And eventually, I do think that the Marine factions, they will unite and they will be serving justice under future Fleet Admiral Kobe. But we can and should also talk about the dawn of the world itself. Skypiea was all about testing that idea. As the mantra of this arc, I've said it so many times during this video already, but it is bring back the light of Shandora. Now, the light of Shandora, it is a tangible item. It is the bell, an item hidden in a section of sky that has remained unreachable for centuries, and it was not found until the Roger pirates got to it, just like Laugh Tale in the bigger world. Roger, just as with the One Piece, couldn't do anything with the bell at the time. All he could do was read the message that was left for him. But Luffy, the second, or I guess third person to reach the bell, could. And what he did, he rang it. Dong. Just as Luffy will be able to use whatever the One Piece is, because it will be the correct time. And during his final battle with Enel, Luffy brings about a literal dawn as well by yelling, "Let the sun shine," as he dispelled Enel's darkness. And the light that reached everyone after this moment was portrayed as particularly radiant, even more so than before Enel cast the darkness. And it was like we were now living in an even brighter era than before. And I do think that we are going to go through a period of of deep darkness in One Piece. That's just where we're heading. One where we won't see the light again until Luffy prevails and triggers the dawn of the world. And I do think that it's going to look stunningly similar to what happened here. Also, when Enel is destroying Skypiea, the Shandians, they are praying to Kalgara, but it is Luffy who answers those prayers. Just as in the modern day, we have people praying to Nika and Luffy answering. But on top of that, there's even a surprisingly compelling theory that Luffy himself is a descendant of the Shandian tribe and Kalgara himself. Because Luffy, he is a simple yet distinct character design in One Piece. There are a few people who look like him, such as young Goldie Roger, but there is only one character in the history of the series that looks exactly like Luffy, and that is Seto. This boy is just Luffy in Shandian cosplay, and Seto went on to marry Kalgara's daughter Moose, which is where the theory that Luffy could be a descendant of Kalgara comes from, and why it was all the more meaningful that Luffy was the one to reignite the light of Shandora, which resulted in the Shandians finally being able to reclaim their home. And at the end of One Piece, I believe that people all across the planet will be able to reclaim all of the lands that were swallowed up by the sea during the Void Century. And just on this whole world business, a lesser known quirk of One Piece is that author Eiichiro Oda writes a special comment that goes at the beginning of each new printed volume. They're usually completely useless information like, "Hey everybody, newsflash, if you ingest too much sugar because of an unbalanced diet, do not think you can correct it by eating too much sodium. Rawr." And look, I guess that's not entirely useless information, but at the same time, if you were the kind of person who needed to hear that, then you've probably got bigger problems. But occasionally, a very special comment pops up, such as the one Oda offered in volume 32, which notably is the volume where Luffy defeats Enel, brings the sun back to Skypiea, and restores the light of Shandora. And Oda's comment for this volume was, apparently, this world's going to turn out as expected. For those who expect that it won't turn out as expected, if it doesn't turn out as expected, it will have turned out as expected. So you see, the world's going to turn out as expected. Those are the cryptic words that he chose to say about the volume that gives away both the past and future of One Piece. So take that as you will, but from what we can gather here, this world is going to turn out as expected.